各位弟兄姊妹平安，好開心今日可以透過網上直播同咁多位下午堂嘅弟兄姊妹一齊參與崇拜。過去一個星期，見到世界各地好多地方仍然受到疫情嘅影響，我哋難免會感到擔憂。但係詩篇34篇1至6節講到，我要時時稱頌耶和華，讚美他的話必常在我口中。我的心必因耶和華誇耀，謙卑人聽見就要喜樂。你們和我當稱耶和華為大，一同高舉他的名。我曾尋求耶和華，他就應允我，救我脫離了一切的恐懼。凡仰望他的便有光榮，他們的臉必不蒙羞。我這困苦人呼求，耶和華便垂聽，救我脫離一切患難。弟兄姊妹們，讓我哋同心敬拜，一同頌讚尋求神，神就必定會救我哋脫離一切嘅困境。每當我們同心敬拜，來讓全世界知道我主極美善尊貴，榮光裏聖潔無瑕。每當我們同心敬拜，憑熱誠讚美頌揚，令世上各方驚嘆，神恩惠奇異無價，同頌讚主聖名，舉起手和應，同站恩典之中，依靠救主誇勝，同頌讚主聖名，一心稱這頌揚，同回應主恩深愛未泯。每當我們同心敬拜，來讓全世界知道我主極美善尊貴，榮光裏聖潔無瑕。每當我們同心敬拜，來讓全世界知道我主極美善尊貴，榮光裏聖潔無價，同頌讚主聖名，舉起手和應，同站恩典之中，依靠救主誇勝，同頌讚主聖名，一心稱這頌揚，同回應主恩深愛未泯。同頌讚主聖名，舉起手和應，同站恩典之中，依靠救主誇勝，同頌讚主聖名，一心稱這頌揚，同回應主恩深愛未泯，同回應主恩深愛未泯，同回應主恩深愛未泯。讓我哋一齊低頭祈禱。親愛嘅天父，你係榮耀嘅君王，獨一嘅真神。我哋藉住你兒子耶穌基督，先可以嚟到你面前，得憐恤蒙恩惠。感謝你為我哋預備偉大完美嘅救恩，並揀選我哋成為你嘅兒女。感謝神，你喺過去一個星期保守我哋平安度過。好感恩，無論我哋喺生活上遇上順境或逆境，你都會保守我哋，無時無刻關懷我哋。每當我哋遇上難關，都會感受到你賜嘅平安，得到你嘅幫助。 感謝神，你賜俾我哋咁大嘅恩典，求神保守我哋每一日都可以專心仰賴你，跟隨你嘅旨意，行你所喜悅嘅事。榮耀、尊貴、感謝、權能，都歸於至高全能嘅上帝。以上禱告係奉主耶穌基督得勝名字祈求，阿門。
而家係牧禱嘅時間。今日嘅牧禱嘅係有關事工嘅，就感謝神。今日我哋下午堂第一次咧係崇拜上邊咧係網上直播，希望能夠咧係順利嘅進行，直至結束。希望大家都能夠咧喺家中咧安坐家中咧，能夠咧好好我一齊敬拜神。第二方面，今日就下晝嘅時候，我哋嘅小組已經順利舉行咗啦呢個嘅教會新冠疫情安全小組嘅訓練。我哋大概咧有30位不同嘅弟兄姊妹，包括咧係3堂國語堂、廣東堂同埋咧係英文堂咧，呢班弟兄姊妹咧係接受訓練，希望咧係為到將來嘅我哋實體崇拜咧係作出準備嘅。第三方面就係咧我哋嘅過渡小組嘅成員代表咧已經選出嚟啦。我哋都好感謝神，能夠咧係使到咧係教牧團都能夠一致嘅能夠咧係認同，同埋咧係我哋嘅執事會咧係一致通過。咁咧個人名有啲人知道，一陣間我哋再報告嘅時間咧，阿史牧師咧係會再詳細咧係講俾大家聽。咁啊又為到咧阿簡迪明牧師同埋咧係師母都好歡迎，但係都嚟到我哋當中，更加佢女兒坐在我哋當中，更加咧係為到咧係簡迪明牧師嘅母親嘅病情咧有所好轉，都求住咧賜福佢嘅家人。更加咧為到咧我哋嘅李同樣弟兄嘅手術咧係而家康復咧係在家中嘅係咧係休息，係希望能夠咧佢盡早咧係能夠恢復健康。特別為到我哋下午堂啦，邦尼姊妹佢咧係即係準備安排咧係返香港探望佢嘅生病嘅爸爸，求主都保守佢。更加為到前中浸主任牧師于建中牧師，因為咧佢咧係心律咧突然咧係有所突跌，佢咧已經咧上個星期咧已經接受咗咧安裝呢個心律調節器嘅手術，而家咧喺屋企咧係休息，求神咧都保守佢。我哋一齊低頭誠心祈禱。主要在呢個疫情裏邊，我哋真係只有仰望你。人算什麼？你都眷顧佢哋。我哋求主能夠將到我哋嘅今日，因為疫情係第一次係崇拜上邊嘅直播，希望能夠係順利嘅進行，直至到結束。能安在家中嘅弟兄姊妹，能夠係一起同心，能夠係敬拜你。更加咧為到今日嘅下晝，能夠咧係新冠疫情安全小組能夠順利嘅完成嘅呢個嘅訓練。我哋有不同嘅堂嘅弟兄姊妹一齊參加，大約有30位咁多。求主保守帶領佢哋有咁嘅心嚟侍奉你。在不久嘅將來，我哋能夠實體崇拜嘅時候，都能夠用得着，都能夠同心合意嘅，能夠咧使到我哋參加我哋崇拜嘅弟兄姊妹互相合作、互相尊重，能夠咧係大家保持咧根據呢個政府所規定嘅，能夠大家彼此都有一個健康嘅身體。更加為到呢個嘅過渡小組嘅成員代表已經順利選出，得到牧師團教牧團同埋執事會全體通過。求主帶領簡牧師及各成員咧同心合意，一起計劃將來我哋嘅路向。更加為到感謝你嘅都能夠使到咧係簡迪明牧師佢嘅母親嘅病情咧有所咧係改善。求主帶領佢同埋咧佢家人嘅平安。更加為到你同樣弟兄手術嘅康復，能夠咧係順利完成咗個手術，而家在家咧係休息。 求主能夠使佢有一個好快嘅康復身體，能夠係繼續在教會侍奉你。更加為到佢嘅太太阿 Pat 同埋女兒 Vivian 都擺上，求主使佢咧悉心去照顧阿 Jo，能夠使佢咧身心靈都健康。特別為到我哋下午堂嘅 Bonnie 姊妹，佢已經係可以得到澳洲政府返香港係照顧佢同埋見佢嘅爸爸。求主能夠使佢能夠係聰明智慧，能夠咧知道咩時間返去，同埋喺澳洲嘅所有嘅事工都可以安排得到。更加為到我哋前中任主任牧師于建中牧師，最近因為佢心律咧係唔係好正常，佢已經上星期接受咗安裝心律截調器嘅手術，求主賜佢早日康復。雖然佢而家咧係傷口有啲痛，但係咧都求主俾佢能夠使於師母能夠咧係好好嘅照顧佢，求主保守帶領。我哋咁樣嘅，我哋將我哋以下嘅時間，未來更加為到我哋嘅疫情都完全擺上，求主眷顧。特別為到維多利亞省而家疫情嘅爆發得好厲害，好似又難以控制，求主能夠保守帶領佢哋。更加我哋感謝你能夠使到簡迪明牧師今日嚟到我哋下午堂當中分享你嘅信息。更加又感謝你能夠使到何耀基弟兄能夠翻譯，求主佢所講嘅都能夠使到我哋明白，能夠使到我哋都能夠不但明白，能夠可以藉着你嘅旨意行出嚟。我哋咁樣以上有聲無聲嘅禱告，都係託賴主耶穌基督聖名祈求，阿門。而家我讀出今日嘅講道嘅經文，係記載喺創世記第22章1至到3節，同埋12至19節。創世記第22章第1節，這時候神要試驗亞伯拉罕，就呼叫他說：亞伯拉罕。他說：我在這裏。神說：你帶着你的兒子，就是你獨生的兒子，你所愛的以撒，往摩利亞地去，在我所要指示你的山上，把他獻為燔祭。亞伯拉罕清早起來，備上驢，帶着2個僕人和他兒子以撒。他劈好了燔祭的柴，就起身往神所指示他的地方去了。第12節，天使說：你不可在這童子身上下手，一點不可害他。現在我知道你是敬畏神的了，因為你沒有將你的兒子，就是你獨生的兒子留下不給我。亞伯拉罕舉目觀看，不料有一隻公羊，兩角扣在稠密的小樹中。亞伯拉罕就取了那隻公羊來，獻為燔祭，代替他的兒子。亞伯拉罕給他那地方起名叫耶和華以勒，直到今日還說：在耶和華的山上必有預備。耶和華的使者第2次從天上呼叫亞伯拉罕說：耶和華說，你既了行了這事，不留下你的兒子，就是你獨生的兒子，我便指着自己起誓說：論福，我必賜大福給你；論子孫，我必叫你的子孫多起來，如同天上的星、海邊的沙。你子孫必得着仇敵的城門，並且地上萬國都必因你的後裔得福，因為你聽從了我的話。於是亞伯拉罕回到他僕人那裏，他們一同起身往別是巴去。亞伯拉罕就住在別是巴。今日好高興，我哋嘅代主任牧師簡迪明牧師嚟到我哋當中證道。佢嘅講題係亞伯拉罕，一個持續過渡的人生。 我哋又高興係何耀基弟兄係做傳譯，我哋恭敬將時間交俾佢哋兩位。
Good afternoon, everybody.
各位午安。
It's a real privilege to be able to come and to worship with you and be together, even in our remote locations here this afternoon.
對我嚟講，真係一個好好嘅機會，雖然係一個咁遙遠嘅地方。
And it's a real privilege to be able to share from God's Word with you today.
實在係我一個權利，可以分享神嘅話語。
Look, having grown up in rural parts of New South Wales, when I was in my denominational role, it involved me moving about across the state of New South Wales and the ACT. And I was reminded as I did that so often was how vital the bridges were that I had to travel across so that I could get from one place to another.
我自己喺紐省嘅郊外長大，我嘅工作亦都係牽涉喺紐省同埋首都領地，係管理住一啲浸信會嘅教會。我知道橋梁對我係幾咁重要，因為我要由一個地方去到另一個地方。
I needed to cross the harbour, rivers, creeks, valleys, gorges and so on, just to get from one place to another.
當我要經過雪梨港或者河流、溪澗、山谷或者係峽道嘅時候，我就要經過好多呢啲橋梁，由一個地方去另一個地方。
Bridges were important. In fact, they were essential aspects of my journeying so that I could fulfill the tasks that I believe that God had called me to, and particularly that as I moved from one circumstance to another.
呢啲橋梁好重要，其實係喺我個旅程裏邊最重要嘅一部分，因為冇咗佢哋，我就唔可以由一個地方去另一個地方去完成我相信係神呼召我去做嘅嘢。
Otherwise, I had to take detours that would take me much, much longer to get from one place to another.
如果唔係，我可能就要兜一個大彎，可能就需要2倍嘅時間先去到目的地。
It was true with some of the places that I travelled overseas, which I had the privilege to do from time to time.
呢個情形亦都發生喺當我去外地遊埠，呢個我好彩，我有好多咁嘅機會。
Well, on most occasions, the bridges were quite smooth and easy to cross. There were some instances where the bridges were rough and ready and narrow and even unstable.
大部分時間嚟講，呢啲橋梁都係好順、好易經過，但係亦都有唔同嘅情況裏邊，佢哋係好難、好窄，或者甚至係唔安全。
There may be times when a bridge had collapsed or was out of action for a period of time, and I had to find deviations or detours or alternative means to actually get to the other side.
亦都喺唔同嘅情況之下，呢啲橋梁可以係倒塌或者係壞咗，咁我就冇辦法，我要兜圈或者係用另一個方法先可以由一個地方去到另一邊。
From time to time, my wife Judy and I would visit one of our daughters and her husband who lived and worked as missionaries with Wycliffe in the eastern highlands of Papua New Guinea.
我太太 Judy 同埋我都不時咁會去探我個女同埋我個女婿，佢哋喺新幾內亞東邊高原係幫一個宣教組織叫做威克里夫工作嘅。
And there's one main road which actually leads into the mission, where they had to enter in and out of the compound. And you had to travel over this bridge if you wanted to enter into the compound across the river.
而引領去呢個宣教組織呢個地方有一條路，當中我哋要經過一條橋，係跨過嗰個河流。
This bridge had been built in around the 1940s, and it provided, I guess, a bit of a lifeline for the missionaries and the locals for getting in and out, as well as bringing in their supplies.
呢條橋係40年代就起好嘅啦。對於呢啲宣教人士同埋當地人嚟講，出入加埋佢哋啲貨物，呢個就係佢哋嘅命脈。
But in 2014, when a tanker was leaving the compound, the bridge collapsed under it into the river.
喺2014年嘅一日，當一架運油車經過嘅時候，成條橋就冧咗落個河裏邊。
It certainly caused an enormous amount of inconvenience for quite some time, as people and goods had to be transported or transitioned across the river.
呢個就造成好多嘅障礙，而且係一段唔短嘅時間，因為不論人同埋貨物都要運經過呢條河。
And an alternative, an innovative and creative solution was found by erecting a flying fox over the river to get goods into the mission.
一個改革或者係一個創新嘅方法，最後就揾到出嚟。佢哋整起咗一個叫做空中飛狐，利用啲繩索將啲貨物運入去呢個組織裏邊。
Sometime later, they actually built a lower bridge further down in a narrow part of the river, which enabled smaller vehicles to kind of pass in and out of the compound.
喺不久之後，佢哋就建立咗一條臨時，不過係細啲嘅河，喺河流細啲嘅橋，喺河流嘅下游方面，咁咧就俾一啲細啲嘅車輛可以經過。
Another example is when a ship actually hit the Tasman Bridge down in near Hobart in Tasmania in 1975, and actually split the city into two.
喺1975年喺塔斯曼尼亞省荷伯特市嗰條塔斯曼橋，就係因為俾隻船撞爛咗，就將呢個荷伯特市係分為二。
In that case, they actually only way across was by boat, and so they ended up creating a new city on the other side of the river.
佢哋唯一一個方法去過呢條河，就係利用啲船，咁結果就產生咗另外一個城市啦。
And then again, there was a time when Judy and I were living in the Central West, when a truck also caused the bridge over the Macquarie River at Wellington to collapse into the river.
喺我同我太太喺紐省西面一個城市叫做威靈頓住嘅時候，亦都有同樣事發生。一架貨車就撞爛咗條橋就冧咗落條河裏邊，叫做麥哥里河。
Which meant you either had to take a detour that took hours, or for a while we were able to cross a railway bridge and get on the railway line to get across the river.
我哋一係就兜好遠嘅路，一係就借用嗰條火車嘅橋去經過。
Until the army built like a barge bridge further down the river that people could cross for a while until it took the 2 years to build a new bridge.
直至到軍隊咧就幫我哋喺大概要成2年先至起好翻條橋，個軍隊咧就幫我哋整咗一條臨時過渡嘅橋喺嘅河嘅下流嗰度。
Now the reason I'm talking about bridges is because similarly we are called in life to cross bridges.
我點解一路喺講到咁多橋嘅事呢？因為其實喺我哋嘅生命裏面，我哋好多時都係被呼召去過呢啲橋。
And the bridges of our life journey are transitions that take us from one place, often a fairly stable place, to another stable place. But in between, there's often confusion or uncertainty or chaos.
喺我哋生命歷程裏邊嘅橋，其實佢哋就係將我哋由一個通常都比較穩定嘅狀況嘅地方帶去另一個地方。而當中就會產生好多困惑、不確定，甚至混亂。
And at times these bridges can seem quite rocky and less stable and secure.
呢啲橋有時係好唔穩定，令到我哋好覺得好唔安全。
And sometimes they may even cause us to be anxious or fearful about moving and getting across to the other side.
有時甚至令到我哋覺得好恐懼或者好驚惶，究竟我哋可唔可以安全去到對面呢？
And many of them might be unfamiliar and not necessarily straightforward.
好多呢啲橋係我哋唔熟悉嘅，佢哋一定唔係簡單或者係直接㗎啦。
And such transitions in our lives are often triggered by marker events. Things like resignations or promotions or retirements, or times when we get married, or when a relationship breaks down, or when there is a pregnancy or a serious illness, or an accident, a birth or a death, a moving house, children leaving home, or the movement from one phase of life to another, and so on.
呢啲生命過渡通常都係有啲好特別嘅事件會發生，譬如辭職、升職、退休、結婚、關係嘅破裂、懷孕、大病或者係意外、生育或者係死亡、搬屋或者係兒女離開家庭。總而言之，佢哋就係由生命嘅一段帶到去另一段。
And this has been particularly true during this pandemic times.
喺而家疫情咁嚴峻嘅時候，對我哋嚟講就係絕對正確啦。
But transitions also occur within the life of our faith communities. Times such as when a pastor leaves, or a dear friends move on or return home, or when certain ministries come to a close, or when they start up. Whenever there is grief and loss.
呢啲過渡嘅情形，亦都係產生喺我哋嘅呢個信仰嘅團體裏邊。譬如牧師辭職，或者你個好朋友離開，返佢個家園，又或者有啲侍奉嘅工作完結，或者一個新嘅侍奉工作嘅開始，當中就會引起咗好多失落同埋悲傷。
See, as a church, we are currently in a season of transition, crossing a bridge from what has been familiar in the past into a new place, which we're not altogether sure will take us.
作為一個教會，中央浸信會喺而家就係喺一個過渡嘅季節裏邊，我哋要經過一條橋梁，由我哋好熟悉嘅過去，去一個新嘅地方，係一個我哋完全唔知道、唔肯定係咩嘅地方。
These are all bridges to cross, moving from one phase to another.
喺一個階段去到另一個階段嘅生命裏邊，就有咁多嘅橋梁要過。
And bridges come in all shapes and sizes. Some are long and others are short. Some are narrow, others are wide. Some are straight and others are variable.
呢啲橋梁佢哋可能有唔同嘅形狀、唔同嘅大細，有闊、有窄、有短、有長、有直、有曲折。
And such changes of life and church transition brings all kinds of responses from within us. And some of these responses can be things like shock and immobilization, where they actually paralyze us. Or there could be periods of denial or depression. The need to maybe let go of things that have been important in the past, testing new options and opportunities, searching for meaning and for direction, integrating our new circumstances into our lives.
呢啲生命嘅過渡情況，或者我哋嘅教會嘅延續嘅情況，就會產生喺我哋裏邊不同嘅反應，譬如震驚，以至到癱瘓、否定、失落、放棄過去嘅一部分，嘗試去做新嘅方案，或者去尋找新嘅意義同埋方向，或者我哋去連接新嘅處境。
The danger is that we can get stuck on the bridge, or we decide to return where we've come from because we no longer want to transition to the place where maybe God is taking us.
對我哋嚟講，最危險嘅就係我哋棘住喺條橋上邊，或者我哋回轉頭返去我哋當初開始嗰度，唔想再去新嗰一度。
Now, many of these are just the normal and natural stages of life that we go through.
好多喺呢個生命上嘅過渡係正常同埋自然嘅過程，我哋一定要經過。
At other times, though, they are things that are initiated by God.
但係有陣時呢啲過渡嘅情況其實係神引導嘅。
Which brings me to the story of Abraham, a story of a man who had a courageous trust in a God who initiated permanent transition or mobility into his life.
我哋跟住落嚟就睇亞伯拉罕嘅故事。呢個故事係關於一個人，佢有好超人嘅信心喺神嗰度，而神就喺佢個生命裏邊開展咗一個永恆嘅改變同埋移動。
From the time that Abraham was called to leave his country, he was constantly crossing bridges in his journey with God as God led him into new experiences and places towards the promise that God had called him to.
亞伯蘭由佢被召去離開本族本家嘅時候，佢就一路同神同行，一路行呢個咁多嘅橋。神就帶佢去到新嘅經驗、新嘅地方，直至到神俾佢嘅承諾係到達。
And it's really important for us to hear the stories of our fathers and mothers in the faith, both from the scriptures and in our own journey of the church here and others that have gone before us, because we will gain rich insight into the nature of faith.
對我哋嚟講，聽到咁多呢啲我哋前人或者係我哋信心祖先嘅關於信心嘅故事，係幫助我哋有更加深嘅認識，去明白信心嘅本質。
It helps us to get in touch with our spiritual roots and to discover new dimensions of what it actually means to be part of the family of God.
亦都幫我哋更加了解屬靈嘅根基，同埋知道作為神嘅一家人係佢兒女嚟講，我哋接觸到嘅範圍，我哋嘅觀點係點。
Even more importantly, it helps us to gain fresh perspectives of the way that God actually works with us and works with people as they're going through periods of transition.
更加重要嘅其實就係喺呢段旅程裏邊，神係同你同我一齊過咁多橋梁嘅時候，我哋當中所採集到嘅觀點同埋經驗。
And this is true of Abraham, the father of our faith.
喺呢個信心之父亞伯拉罕嘅故事嚟講，呢個係絕對正確。
Because we find Abraham's story there in the book of Genesis.
我哋會見到亞伯拉罕嘅故事係喺呢個聖經嘅創世記。
And the first glimpse that we actually get of Abraham is he's there in southern Mesopotamia, which is in part of the old Chaldean or Babylonian culture.
我哋第一次見到亞伯蘭，佢仲係住喺美索不達米亞平原南邊嗰度。以前巴比倫有好大嘅習俗嘅影響嘅地方。
And he's grown up and he's lived there for about 60 years.
佢喺嗰度長大同埋居住咗大概有60年。
It was rich pastoral land, and Abraham's family had done well.
嗰度地方好富庶，佢個家族亦都過得唔錯。
They would have been quite comfortable and well settled there.
佢哋其實好安逸，亦都好開心咁喺嗰度安頓下來。
But subsequently, due to God's call upon his life, he and his clan moved up north to Haran. And there was the most formative event occurred in his life.
但係因為神對佢嘅呼召，佢就帶住佢全族人北向去哈蘭，就喺嗰度喺佢嘅生命裏邊就產生咗最重要嘅事情。
God met him and made an extraordinary promise.
神遇見佢，就同佢俾咗一個好重要、好特別嘅應許。
A land of his own, descendants more numerous than the sands of the sea, a name that would resound throughout history, and best of all, a means by which all the families of the earth would be blessed.
佢有佢自己嘅土地，佢嘅後裔比海上邊嘅沙更多。佢嘅名喺歷史上流傳千古。最好嘅就係地上萬族都因為佢而受到祝福。
And in response, Abraham was to do only one thing.
回應嚟講，亞伯拉罕淨係需要做一樣嘢。
He was to move from where he was And he was to set off on a journey with God who would lead him step by step.
佢就係只去離開佢原本嘅家鄉，同埋神一樣踏上征途，神就一步一步咁帶住佢。
And the Lord will provide would be his central reality for the whole unfolding of Abraham's story.
喺成本未打開嘅亞伯拉罕嘅故事裏邊，神自有預備就變咗成個嘅中心事實。
No matter where he found himself, no matter what circumstances, he was confident that God would provide the needs for him and his family, both in the present and into the future.
不論佢去到邊度或者遇到咩情況，佢好有信心，神係會俾佢同埋佢屋企所有人，不論係現在係直至將來所有佢需要嘅嘢。
So instead of giving Abraham something to settle down with, some secure, tangible factor or anchor, God gave him a promise that was related to movement.
以其俾亞伯拉罕一啲好確切、好穩定嘅倚靠，神俾佢嘅應許其實係連結在於行動上邊。
There are those who have suggested that the pagan religions of that ancient time centered on stability in the midst of chaos.
或者有人以為喺呢個上古時代呢個異教嘅中心思想會諗呢個叫做混亂中嘅安定。
But this isn't necessarily the faith of the people of God.
但係呢個我相信絕對唔係，尤其是呢個神嘅跟從者嘅信心。
Theirs was to be a faith of travel, of journeying, of pilgrimage.
呢個嘅信心係一個遊歷、一個旅程、一個朝聖嘅旅程。
Abraham did not settle permanently in any particular location.
亞伯拉罕佢冇停留喺任何一個地方裏邊。
Security in one's relationship with God has little to do with remaining still, of being static, but rather extending oneself in the direction of God.
要建立同神一個固定嘅關係，絕對唔係停頓下來，反之係要繼續跟住神嘅方向，我哋繼續去開展。
It's a faith of promise, not one of constant rest.
呢個係信心嘅應許，絕對唔係永恆嘅安定。
In fact, Abraham's story informs us as people of faith that God works in the midst of change, and that those changes, whether they influence the people in Palestine or Egypt or Israel or Australia or Sydney or here at CBC.
亞伯拉罕嘅呢個故事就話俾我哋聽，作為信徒，我哋有信心嘅話，我哋就會知道神嘅作工係喺轉動當中。不論呢啲轉動係影響喺巴勒斯坦、埃及、以色列、澳洲或者係雪梨嘅你。
God doesn't attempt to freeze life or ministry or permanence.
神絕對唔係試圖去將我哋嘅生命或者我哋嘅事工冷凍落嚟。
In fact, Abraham's dwelling place emerges as the symbol of his lifestyle and the spirit by which he responded to God.
而其實係就以亞伯拉罕居住嘅地方，呢個就係代表佢生命態度嘅符號，亦都係一個代表佢對神嘅回應嘅精神。
For a century, he wandered around the land living in tents.
喺100年裏邊，佢喺佢嗰度附近周圍都移動，而係住喺呢個帳幕裏邊。
He was always a friend and a witness to his neighbours without engaging in their pagan activities.
對於佢啲鄰居嚟講，佢係一個朋友，亦都係一個見證者， 但係佢冇參與佢哋嗰啲異教嘅活動。
He didn't isolate himself. And while he was seeking to live as a follower of God, wherever he found himself.
佢絕對冇隔離佢自己，但係無論搬到去邊度，佢都繼續係生活喺一個神嘅跟從者咁嘅狀態裏邊。
Genesis 23 tells us that Abraham was a stranger and a sojourner in the land of Canaan.
創世記23章第4節嗰度講，喺迦南地裏邊，亞伯拉罕其實係一個陌生者同埋一個寄居客。
He was forever on the move.
佢係不停移動。
His dwelling place could be dismantled and quickly erected in another place within hours.
佢住嘅地方可能喺幾個鐘頭之內就會拆咗，又跟住搬去另一個新嘅地方。
And it could have been very easy for this wealthy Old Testament saint to purchase a huge and permanent mansion and settle down.
其實對於呢一個舊約嘅偉人，佢要起一個好大嘅屋而安頓下來，真係易過。
Genesis 24 says he actually had the wealth and the manpower to build a castle.
創世記24章第35節就講佢又有財富又有能力，可以建造一個好大嘅堡壘。
And how tempting it must have been for him to return to the lush land there in Mesopotamia, that beautiful and secure land of his childhood.
其實對佢嚟講係一個好大嘅誘惑，因為佢可以翻去佢童年美索不達米亞平原嘅地方，又靚又富庶。
There was certainly opportunity to return, but he didn't.
其實佢有好多機會去翻呢個地方，但係佢冇做到。
Why? Because Abraham was bent on doing the will of God.
點解佢冇做呢？因為亞伯拉罕就係信服於神嘅旨意裏邊。
God had called him to leave his homeland, and though he didn't understand all that God was accomplishing through his life and what God would accomplish through those who lived after him, he walked in the light and he obeyed what God had revealed.
因為神呼召佢離開佢個本族本家，雖然佢唔知道神藉着佢嘅生命或者係佢嘅後代嘅生命可以成就到啲乜嘢，但係佢聽從神嘅話，行喺佢嘅光之中。
He never doubted God's promises.
佢從來都冇懷疑神嘅應許。
Now, God doesn't call all of us to pack up and move to another land, though he will for some of us. And many of you, I know here, have actually done that in the past.
嗱，神冇叫我哋全部所有人收起包袱就起身去新嘅地方。雖然佢可能對我哋當中某啲人咁做，又或者其實我哋好多人以前曾經咁做過。
However, he has called all of us to journey, to be on a spiritual pilgrimage, to continue to grow.
但係佢會繼續叫我哋起行，去走呢條屬靈上邊嘅旅途，去繼續成長。
He doesn't want any of us, nor our church, to be static, to be settled for long periods of time.
佢唔想我哋任何一個或者係我哋嘅教會係停頓下來太長久。
Yet that is something that the children of Israel forgot, often during their journey towards the promised land, particularly after they'd left Egypt.
呢個證實正就係產生喺呢個以色列嘅民眾，佢哋忘記咗，當佢哋係向緊呢個應許之地走緊嘅時候，特別係當佢哋啱啱離開埃及。
They'd find an oasis, and they would rest, and then they'd want to become settled there. And at times when things got rough, they just decided that they wanted to go back to Egypt, into slavery again.
當佢哋揾到個綠洲，佢哋想休息，休息完之後，佢哋直情想安頓落嚟。當佢哋遇到情況唔係咁順利嘅時候， 佢哋甚至係投訴，仲話佢哋想翻去埃及做奴做婢。
And therefore they would have been forfeiting the blessings that God wanted to give them.
而咁樣佢哋就喪失咗神預備咗俾佢嘅祝福。
All of us have bridges to cross in our journeys, transitions to make.
我哋每一個人喺旅途上邊一定有橋梁、有過渡嘅嘢要做。
Some of them will be tougher than others, at times unfamiliar and maybe long, but may even at times we'll have to take detours. But unless we cross those bridges, unless we transition, we will never discover the rich blessings that God has for us.
呢啲橋梁有一啲係比較難，或者我哋唔熟悉，又好長。我哋可能需要兜路，但係如果我哋唔過呢啲橋梁嘅時候，我哋就永遠唔會發現到神為我哋預備咁好嘅祝福喺岸嘅另一邊。
There will be times when we will need to rest, to recover, to renew, to refresh, to be revitalized.
當然有啲時間我哋要停低去復原、去更新。
But not to settle. We are called to be travelers, to be pilgrims, not settlers.
但係我哋唔係要安頓下來，因為我哋係要繼續我哋嘅旅途。我哋係一個朝聖者，唔係一個安頓者。
Now, the portrait of Abraham that is given to us in the scripture is not of a perfect or even a brave man.
喺經文裏邊俾到我哋睇到亞伯拉罕嘅描述，佢絕對唔係一個完美或者係一個勇敢嘅人。
Rather, God uses a person who is imperfect and at times who is positively cowardly and weak.
反過嚟講，神就用咗一個唔完美嘅人，有陣時我哋仲會發覺佢非常之膽怯或者係軟弱。
Look, he was tested many times in his circumstances and didn't always trust as he should have.
喺唔同嘅情景之下，佢受到試探嘅時候，佢就已經失咗佢嘅信心。
For example, when he arrived in Canaan, there was a great famine that was happening. But rather conferring with God, he quickly headed down to Egypt because there he could find abundance.
就正如佢啱啱去到迦南嘅時候，嗰度有饑荒，佢冇同神商議，佢就自己決定即刻落咗去埃及，因為嗰度物產非常之豐富。
I mean, it was the logical thing to do and probably a good strategic thing to do. Later on, God in fact used Egypt to supply food to Joseph and his brothers. But Abraham was in too much of a hurry, rather than to seek what God wanted him to do.
呢個或者係一個合理嘅做法，又或者係一個策略性嘅好嘅做法，因為神就利用埃及喺後來將食物供應俾約瑟同埋佢嘅兄弟。不過亞伯拉罕呢個決定實在太急，佢冇尋求過神嘅心意。
It was a person-centered decision rather than a God-centered decision.
呢個係一個個人中心嘅決定，唔係一個以神為中心嘅決定。
And then there was a time when he became fearful of retaliation and potential poverty and whether he would have any descendants, which came just after he had shown some real bravery and strength against an enemy.
又喺另一個情形裏邊，佢就好擔心敵人嘅報復，又或者佢成個族會陷入貧乏嘅境況，同埋佢冇後裔喎。其實佢啱啱打完勝仗，應該好有信心。
Then again, he tried to use his own solution because humanly he became impatient with God and his timing. And he began to doubt whether God's promises would materialize.
咁有一次佢係用佢自己嘅方法， 因為作為一個人，佢對神感覺到有啲感覺到神唔知佢個時間啊，有少唔可以接受佢太慢，就開始懷疑神嘅祝福係咪可以成就。
Again, he was trying to find his own solution. For him, God seemed to be taking too long, and that time was running out.
對佢嚟講，佢覺得神嘅時間實在太慢，佢又用自己嘅方法啦。
Sarah was growing old.
佢太太撒萊亦都係年紀大。
He still believed God, but he was bewildered by why he didn't have an heir, because he'd already been in Canaan for 10 years.
佢仍然係信神，不過開始有少少迷惑，因為點解佢仲未有後裔？因為佢哋已經去咗迦南地有10年啦。
And he listened to Sarah's arguments, which was mixed with motives and limited to what God could do.
佢接受咗撒萊嘅論據，雖然呢個論據有好多唔同嘅原因同埋動機，亦都因為佢哋嘅決定係局限咗神可以做嘅嘢。
And Abraham even adopted the practices of his former pagan culture in trying to find his own solution.
好不幸，亞伯拉罕又用翻佢以前異教嘅習俗，去利用自己嘅方法去找。
And that decision not only impacted the family and the intergenerations to come, but continues to affect our world today, particularly in the Middle East.
而最後嘅結果不但影響佢嘅家庭同埋佢個後代，大家睇下，其實都影響而家嘅世界。當我哋定眼喺呢個中東嘅情形。
The greatest test that Abraham faced was the story we read earlier in Genesis 22.
亞伯拉罕面對最大嘅試探就係剛才我哋讀嘅經文喺創世記22章。
Things were going well since the birth of Isaac. And suddenly this command comes from God, which would have torn his heart apart. 以
撒出世之後，每件事都好似好順利，但係突然之間，神呢個命令就令到佢嘅心完全破碎。
How could this be so? Just when all of God's plans seemed aligned, and then God appears to be taking away his promises to Abraham.
當神嘅計劃好似好順利咁進行嘅時候，點解可以發生呢件事呢？因為神好似係想拎走對亞伯拉罕嚟講一個最大嘅祝福。
And though he's surprised and shocked, he's still obedient.
雖然佢覺得好意外同埋好震驚，不過佢都係信服。
And then after a few days of following God's command, at the very last moment, knowing Abraham's obedience and faith, God intervenes with his own provision.
經過咗幾日，佢一路都跟隨住神嘅指令，喺最後一刻，神知道亞伯拉罕本身嘅信服同埋信心，佢出手，因為佢有佢嘅預備。
And although he made mistakes, Abraham never forgets or loses sight of God's promises, of God's plan. And most important, he didn't lose sight of God himself.
雖然亞伯拉罕有唔少嘅錯處，不過總括嚟講，佢冇忘記咗神嘅應許、神嘅計劃。而佢永遠定睛喺神嘅身上。
The Lord took him from where he was and moved him step by step into a deep relationship with himself.
神帶領亞伯拉罕由佢嘅家鄉出嚟， 一步一步咁帶佢，就帶佢同神有更深嘅關係。
Now, there were parts of Abraham, some of his attitudes and values and beliefs that would some time before they were touched by divine truth.
亞伯拉罕佢本身不論喺個態度啊、價值啊或者信念方面，從來都未曾接觸過神嘅真實性，
let alone be transformed.
更何況講要改造佢呢？
Abraham was moved step by step by a gracious and dependable and a patient God.
而佢就係因為有一個好嘅親切、可以信賴同埋好有忍耐嘅神，一步一步咁將佢改造。
It was a process of transformation, one bridge after another.
呢個過渡嘅過程就係要經過一道又一道嘅橋。
And God was working slowly and thoroughly with his servant in order to move him to maturity.
神就好慢咁，但係好完全咁同佢個僕人去工作，因為要將佢訓練到一個成熟嘅階段。
It is typical of God to be patient with growing things.
我哋知道神對於成長嘅事物係特別有耐性。
I might not be particularly patient with the garden's lack of growth at this time of year, but I know the seasons will change and that fruit will come as I tend it and as God brings growth through his provision.
喺呢個冬天嘅時刻，我或者係對於花園嘅植物冇乜生長嘅氣息，感覺到唔係好有耐心。但係我知道春天就會嚟，果實就會成熟。只要我不停咁繼續去料理佢哋，因為神會藉着佢嘅供應，令到呢個生長繼續。
I know that our God is an infinitely patient Lord who cultivates people so that they might become fruitful.
我亦都知道我哋嘅神係一個恆久忍耐嘅神，佢會繼續將我哋係一路咁改造，直至到我哋有成果。
And I know that God works in the lives of churches as they nurture their health and as they seek after him with their heart and minds. As with one mind and purpose together we seek to discern his plans.
我亦都知道神係工作喺教會嘅生命裏面，佢將到我哋嘅教會更為健康，幫助我哋尋找神嘅心意。當我哋每一個人都有同一心志嘅時候，我哋就會睇到佢嘅道路。
God is the one who goes before his people.
神永遠係早過佢嘅信徒就會開步。
God is the one who travels with his people.
神亦都係一個同我哋一齊同行。
God goes before his people, anticipating our journey.
佢會早我哋就行出去，幫我哋預備我哋將來嘅道路。
This was evidently in the case of Abraham and will be evident in the case of CBC.
呢個就係亞伯拉罕嘅故事嘅實證，亦都係同樣對於我哋中央浸信會嘅另一個實證。
So as we come to the end of Abraham's life, there is no doubt that we see a man whose supreme desire is to know God personally, to follow his commands, and to walk in his will.
我哋嚟到睇到亞伯拉罕生命嘅盡頭，毫無疑問，我哋就睇到一個人佢嘅最終目的就係想認識神，跟隨佢嘅誡命，行走在佢嘅旨意當中。
And emerging from a raw paganism, Abraham becomes one of God's most faithful servants.
出生於一啲異教信仰同埋習俗當中，但係亞伯拉罕最終就成為咗神最忠心嘅僕人。
There were many bridges he had to cross.
當中佢要經過好多嘅橋梁。
His mistakes are just as obvious as his successes, but his progress was always onward and upward as he transitioned forward.
佢嘅成功嘅地方同埋佢嘅缺點一樣係咁明顯，但係佢嘅路徑永遠都係向上同埋向前。
As the writer of the Hebrews later noted, Abraham's weaknesses faded in the background in the light of his strengths.
好似希伯來書嘅作者後邊咁樣寫，亞伯拉罕嘅弱點相對比佢嘅成功嘅地方，相對係黯然失色。
By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. The writer says, by faith he made his home in the promised land. Like a stranger in a foreign country, he lived in tents, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God.
希伯來書11章第8至第10節，亞伯拉罕因着信蒙召的時候，就遵命出去，往將來要得為業的地方去。出去的時候，還不知往哪裏去。他因着信，就在所應許之地作客，好像在異地居住膨脹，以那同蒙一個應許的以撒雅各一樣，因為他等候那座有根基的城，就是神所經營所建造的。
Abraham's lifestyle was characterized by two distinct perspectives.
亞伯拉罕嘅一生有兩個好特別嘅特點。
Firstly, he knew that his time on earth was only a temporary existence.
第一，佢知道佢喺世上係一個好短暫嘅寄居。
And secondly, his eyes were always directed to where God was calling him.
第二，佢嘅眼永遠係定睛喺神嘅身上邊。
So we can therefore move into our transitions, whether personal or as a congregation, in trust.
所以我哋可以進入我哋過渡嘅情景裏邊，不論係個人或者一個會眾裏邊，充滿信心。
We might not know the destination for our lives personally or for this church.
或者我哋唔知道我哋嘅終點，不論喺個人方面或者係成個教會裏邊係邊度。
But we do know, however, that we travel with a God who can transform our journey into one with meaning and with purpose and with kingdom significance.
但係我哋知道，當我哋同神一同走路嘅時候，佢就會將我哋嘅旅程變咗一個有意義、有目的同埋有天國。
So let us be a people who continue to journey and not become settlers.
讓我哋一齊去繼續我哋嘅旅程，千祈唔好係停留下來。
Amen.
Amen。
憑信他離別唔易，因信全然奉上愛子，憑信還有人全力抓住天使，贏到祝福，換了名字，憑信他行近紅海。因信連潮浪也分 決心，圍繞在城外，憑信放聲呼喊，城牆變倒塌下來。有先知被擄，他方尚在心裏靜待，仍確信上帝榮耀會回來。憑信我們懷着憑據，因信同尋着了應許，憑信能夠發現在世間只是寄居，朝更美家鄉走回去。
我哋一齊去領受從神而嚟嘅祝福。願主耶穌基督嘅恩惠、天父上帝嘅慈愛同埋聖靈嘅感動，都時時刻刻同我哋每一個人同在，直到永永遠遠。阿門。
讓你我在神家裏盡獻真心不後退，互勉分擔，拋開憂慮也送走疲累。願與你覓尋真理，立志跟基督步履，共你分享主恩滋味，這愛心中記。讓你將基督的愛奉獻世間到未來，攜手衝開黑暗悲哀。我也將主恩高唱，願意此生去傳揚，唯願與你一起作天將。讓你將基督的愛奉獻世間到未來，攜手衝開黑暗悲哀。我也將主恩高唱，願意此生去傳揚，唯願與你一起作天將。
咁咧，我哋好感謝神。咁啊，首先咧，我哋再次嘅好多謝阿簡牧師啊，咁咧去俾我哋嘅信息，同埋佢屋企人同我哋一齊去崇拜。咁唔單止係信息喎，唔單止係敬拜喎，啊，我哋好多謝咧在場嘅我哋嘅製作小組啊，個鏡頭啊應該擰唔到啊，咁我哋個製作小組咧就即係令到我哋呢一個現場直播咧都能夠順利進行，順唔順利進行啊？順利進行啊，咁咧就好感謝神。咁咧我哋都有少少嘅報告啊。咁首先咧就係我哋嘅奉獻啊。咁我哋繼續咧嚟到係用我哋嘅網上崇拜啊，網上嗰個平台咧啊嚟到係嗰個戶口咧嚟到係去做網上嘅奉獻啊。咁希望大家弟兄姊妹咧，我哋繼續係喺呢一個非常嘅時期咧，我哋都唔忘記我哋衷心嘅嚟到係去奉獻啊，俾我哋嘅神。咁另外咧就係我哋呢一個頭先譚傳道咧去祈禱嘅時候，我哋呢個過渡小組嘅成員咧就亮相啦。咁樣咧，我哋今日咧其實喺我哋現場咧已經係有4位咧，就係我哋如果用阿簡牧師嘅信息咧，我哋嘅呢個叫做過橋小組啊，得唔得啊？咁帶我哋過橋嘅呢幾個來自我哋幾個唔同嘅崇拜嘅代表咧，咁佢哋就會係參與喺當中嚟到係同阿簡牧師咧一齊嚟到係出謀獻策啊，亦都係去嚟到係去為中央浸信會咧成個教會，我哋究竟點樣去過渡咧？我哋要去到頭先牧師講嘅嗰個，我哋有個目標嘅，咁我哋就係會同呢一個嘅團隊咧，咁佢哋嚟到係去即係同阿簡牧師一齊去配搭。咁咧，我相信你可以去親自嘅，你認識佢嘅時候咧，你可以去恭喜佢， 但係最更加重要咧就係你去支持佢嚇，為佢哋嚟去祈禱嚇，因為咧呢個咧係唔係淨係關乎我哋任何其中一個嘅崇拜，呢個係關乎我哋成個中央浸信會，我哋成個教會嗰個嘅發展，我哋都係咧係透過呢一個嘅團隊咧嚟到係一齊去嚟到同阿簡牧師去合作嚇，咁我哋都係好感恩嚇，咁亦都係提一提大家嚇，繼續咧當你嚟教會嘅時候，一方面咧你要同辦公室咧嚟到係申請咗先，預約咗先，咁你預約咗之後咧，咁就先至到你嚟嘅時候咧，先至去計劃究竟係去嚟到教會用我哋呢個二維碼個 QR code 嚟到係去填我哋嗰個網上個表格，話俾我哋知去記錄你嚟咗或者咧係用嗰個嘅即係嗰個嘅網址咧，其實都係帶你去同一個嘅目的地嘅啫嚇，咁都係去填嗰個表。咁你係要同辦公室申請咗，辦公室係知道咧你嚟啦 ，OK 咗啦，咁你先至係可以再嚟到嘅時候去填呢個表，係每一次都要填嘅嚇，唔係話你填咗一次之後就得嘅，係每一次你入嚟呢個建築物咧，呢個教會嘅時候，你都要去再填一次嚇，咁樣大家記住啦。咁仲有咧就係如果你係有機會咧喺教會嘅時間係我哋個網上直播嘅時間嘅時候，咁我就即係去提提大家咧唔好去用我哋教會嗰個WiFi，咁咧就一定要係你刪除咗你個 WiFi，令到咧我哋網上直播嘅時候可以係順利可以咧能夠係真係去個連接咧唔會有影響。咁仲有咧就係我哋下個星期有我哋嘅主餐，咁如果你係想攞我哋教會一啲嘅嗰啲communion cup 嗰啲 fellowship cups 嘅時候咧，你可以嚟到辦公室嘅裏邊咧嚟到係同我哋攞嘅都得嘅。咁仲有咧就係我哋關於呢一個銳意門訓我哋即係英文叫做 IDMC 嘅呢個嘅講座咧咁咧就喺8月14、15號係透過 Zoom 咧嚟到係去有呢一個好好嘅一個我哋講點樣作主嘅門徒咁我哋點樣嚟到係去完成神嘅心意亦都係我哋點樣喺我哋嘅生命嘅裏邊咧去祝福我哋身邊嘅人。咁我哋呢個咧係絕對係一個好好嘅一個嘅講座，咁都邀請大家咧去踴躍嘅去參加。8月14至到15號係網上嘅平台進行嘅。咁另外咧，我哋仲有一路嘅有嘅祈禱會我哋嘅聚會，咁希望大家咧繼續去忠心嘅用心嘅，大家一齊互相禱告、守望同埋彼此學習。咁我哋嘅報告咧到呢一度啦。咁今日咧我哋嗰個呢個係現場嘅直播，咁跟住係一個試 run 到之後咧，就我哋會再去做嘅時候咧，亦都會再同大家去講。咁我哋默禱之後咧就可以散開啦。咁我哋下次再見。